So this is a real life story that occurred to me in 2003 when I encountered a hurricane. Now, a bit of context. So I was in my final year of law school, and I was really fortunate to get selected for this course called the Innocence Project, right? It's a criminal course, basically. And I don't know if you've heard of the Innocence Project. It's at selected universities around the world. It's when inmates who proclaim they've been innocently convicted, they write into the Innocence Project, and where there is merit, students, in collaboration with lawyers and barristers, seek to overturn, right? Incredibly important for people who were committed prior to DNA testing. Incredibly important in the US, where 1 in every 9 people on death row are found to have been innocently convicted. Right? Now, it just so happens the year that I did this course, I mean, I had a lot going on. My father recently passed away from lung cancer. I had financial issues. My mum and brother were living in Melbourne. I was up here studying at Griffith Uni. And it just so happens that the spokesman for the course that year was none other than Reuben Hurricane Carter, right? The African-American boxer, who's tragically passed away recently. For those of you who haven't heard of the Hurricane, well, he's played in a movie by Denzel Washington, but he was at the peak of his fighting career, right, in the middle, I think it was 1966, the peak of the civil rights movement in the US, right? And he was en route to become middleweight champion of the world. And he was picked up, arrested, sentenced, right, by the cops in New Jersey to a triple murder homicide. It was a cumulative sentence of something like 196 years. And it was later found he didn't commit that crime. He was framed by the cops, right? He was exonerated some 20 years after. So picture this, if you will. You go into prison in your 20s, at the peak of your physical and mental state, and you come out in your 50s. Similar life journey to Nelson Mandela, of which he met, right? Now, he flew out to Australia that year. Now, this is a picture there. You can see riots in the streets, right? You can see that if you have a close look, led by Muhammad Ali. Right? This is when he met Mandela. And you might know the famous song Hurricane by one of my favourite musicians, Bob Dylan. Now, he came to Australia, and the tutorial class of 2003 was exactly like this. It was about this many students, lawyers. We got to spend the afternoon with him. 5-minute conversation I had with this icon changed the trajectory of my life, and I want to share that with you now. And it was only until many years after that I think, shit, in that moment he really exemplified emotional intelligence, social intelligence, which is why I'm sharing it. So anyway, he came into the tutorial class doors, and I remember this clear as mud, like a movie in my head. I was sitting at the back, and he came in with an African-American colleague. They were wearing these wide-brimmed hats. And he sat down, it was a square setup, and he started telling us about his trials and tribulations in prison. And as he was talking, I swear you could hear a pin drop, like everyone was awestruck. And I remember thinking to myself, how can this person be so humble and warm and magnetic when he's had his life ripped away from him? He was telling us about his trials and tribulations in prison. And he said, my life changed forever. He goes, initially when they imprisoned me, I was consumed with hatred. I hated white people. I hated the system. I hated my life. I didn't want to be here. Right? It was a travesty. You know, he said I was consumed by hatred. And he said, as a consequence of my hatred and refusing to abide by the prison rules or wear their clothing, they would throw me in the hull, an underground bunker, the diameters of which you couldn't even lie down. And he said, I spent weeks on end. My life changed when they brought me up from the hull on one occasion. He said, I was cuffed, escorted by a prison guard, walking through a corridor. And I happened to catch the reflection of my face on a cracked mirror under a flickering light. And he said, what was looking back at me was a monster consumed by hatred. He said, I was shocked. I got back to my prison cell, he said, and I just resigned to the fact, you know what, I'm going to be here for the rest of my life. But you know what, they can imprison my body, but they cannot imprison my mind. I think that's a scene in the movie. I haven't seen it in years, but if you haven't seen it, The Hurricane, it's a tearjerker. I do recommend it. And he said, so therein started a long and arduous journey of my personal self-transformation. He said, I read every bloody book I could in the prison library on things like positive psychology, meditation, Buddhism. And in fact, he meditated so much in prison, they nicknamed him the Buddha. But he said it was because of that journey that I wrote my book, The 16th Round. And it was because of because of that book that people picked it up, right? And it made international headlines. People started to take notice, and that eventually led to the Cool Cats, right? So anyway, he was telling us these stories. I was awestruck. And at the end of that, we all got to mingle, right? I think it was a lunch break, afternoon break. And he was going around introducing himself to people. As I said, I was in a very dark patch in my life. And he came up to me, shook my hand, and I was pretty chuffed at the time. And there was a table exactly like the one in the back corner there. And he said, "Paul, I'm feeling pretty tired. Come and have a chat with me." Right? And everyone wanted a piece of him, but he turned his back to everyone. Right? And I had 5 minutes with the hurricane. And this is what transpired in those 5 minutes. So, when we meet people for the first time, we have this bullshit human protocol. Hey, how you doing? How's the weather? We got through that. And then he started asking about my life and what I wanted to do. And at that stage, I was a different person. I was interested in commercial pursuit. I said I want to be a commercial lawyer. Because of the hurricane, I ended up specialising in the criminal jurisdiction. So after a while, he looked me in the eyes and he said, "Paul, I know we don't know each other that well, right? But I can tell that something's not quite right in your life." And he said, "Let me give you a piece of advice." And I now call this the hurricane connection. He said, when you meet people for the very first time, or maybe it's an external stakeholder, or someone you haven't met, sometimes we put ourselves in a vertical relationship, right? They might be in a higher role, or we might think more of them. But if you want to get the best out of humanity in everyone, right, you've got to put yourself in a horizontal, right? We're all equal, irrespective of your experience, right? He didn't actually say that to me, that part there, but it's important to reflect on. So he said, "This is what I want to tell you." He said, instead of that, he called it verbal diarrhea. He said, instead of the verbal diarrhea that we all have, where we are sizing the other person up, making assumptions, assuming what they're thinking of me, allowing that to dictate our behaviour, he said, "Paul, I want you to stop. I want you to park it and tell yourself this. Tell yourself, we have more things in common than the things that divide us. We have more things in common than the things that divide us." Then he caught me reflecting on that. He said, "Paul, it's something you don't have to convince yourself of, man." He said, because we all experience this pendulum of emotion. Everyone, irrespective of what culture, where you come from. We've all experienced pain, pleasure, right? And he also said that we all come from the same building blocks, from stars that exploded billions of years ago. We're all made of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon. He goes, "Man, you don't have to convince yourself of this." But he said this, he goes, if you tell yourself that and you believe it, and you match it with body language, right? He said, that's when the magic happens. Because the other person feels it. Because why? It reverberates through your body language. They've got your attention. You're locking eye contact. Your tonality is consistent, body language. He didn't know it back then, but neuroscientists have since proven that our thoughts also emit a frequency, right? He said, they drop their barriers. All of a sudden, you have an authentic connection, a fluid flow of information, right? And as he was saying these words to me, I experienced tingles. And I later used that in my profession. For many years, I was a lawyer for the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, right? Hard role. I was on circuit, right, dealing with the most marginalised people in the country. And that helped me to expeditiously build rapport and trust. And I was invited I was on the Curie Court board. I was invited to dinner, and emotion. I'm feeling emotional thinking about this right now, right? It's the power of emotion. So anyway, we had that conversation. I was reflecting. I was in my early 20s, wasn't thinking much of it at the time. And then he got up to leave from the table. And he stood like this, and he just was eyeballing me, right? Like looking into my soul. And I held his gaze. And he said these words to me. He said, "Paul, I know this stuff works, man. I know this works. You know how I know?" And I said, "No, Mr. Carter." He looked into my soul and he said, "Because I'm feeling it now. I'm feeling it now." And I shit you not, ladies and gents, as he said those words, we shed a simultaneous tear. This is the power of human connection. You know those tingles you get when you connect with someone? I felt that connection. And here was a man from the other side of the planet who had so many commitments took 5 minutes to spot that something wasn't quite right in my life. Right? And I'm feeling emotional because I'm reflecting on that. But he was right. In that week that he came, as I said, like, I lost my old man. And in that week he was in Brisbane, I was homeless. I was living out of a car because I couldn't afford to pay my rent, my bills. I got evicted from my place. And it took this guy 5 minutes, right, to just notice that. And I tell you guys, it changed the trajectory of my life. And the reason I'm finishing with this story, everyone in the room has got that ability. We've all heard of Are You OK Day, right? But it's something we can do every day. You notice when your colleagues are down. Notice that subtle body language. Check in with them. And if you're not all right, reach out to someone. We're all human, and life is more than a job. Right? I'm here to tell you guys are family, whether you like it or not. You spend a lot of time with each other, and although you've got different opinions, right, and different views, find that middle ground. Use some of the tools we learned today, and I wish you guys all the best. Thank you.